see. Are you making an entrance? Hey, no, seriously, no, everything good? You're okay? Everything okay? Wait a minute. Do you need to go? Why don't you go take care of that? Lost? He's grown up. Okay. All right. We're ready when you are. Have we started? Does anyone, I've got a blue box, Chris, that I'm looking at. Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. All right, wonderful. Welcome to the Lone Tree City Council study session. It is August 18th, 2020. In support of social distancing requirements and based on space limitations of our buildings, the city is limiting physical attendance at our public meetings to only essential staff, applicants, and elected officials, and will continue to provide access to public meetings via electronic participation for members of our public. All attendees are required to wear face coverings when entering and exiting the building and within 6 feet of another person. The city will also implement symptom monitoring measures for attendees, such as temperature checks and completion of the city's facilities health screening survey before entering the building. There is no public comment during our study sessions because we do not vote. This is our opportunity to learn from staff. Our presentations are for information and council direction only. We are starting off our meeting this afternoon with revisiting the proposed amendments to Chapter 17 of the Municipal Code regarding subdivisions and proposed amendments to the city landscape guidelines for public right-of-way. And Roshana Floyd from Community Development will be presenting to us. Good afternoon, Roshana.
Good afternoon, Mayor, council members. Take this off so that you might be able to better hear me, hopefully. All right, good afternoon. Thank you again for allowing us to bring proposed changes before you relative to Chapter 17. We have refreshed some of the information and we hope that we have answered some of the questions that you had from our previous study session with you. So if I might please have the next slide. All right. Austin started this. We think it's a fantastic idea to lead with just about every presentation that we have. So a quick overview of our vision, our mission, and our 6 big ideas, because this all carries over very nicely into why we have development regulations. Next slide, please. All right. Why do we have subdivision regulations? One of the reasons for this is to create and to protect our place. Next slide, please. All right, among those particular components are natural corridors, cultural resources, and our view sheds. Next slide, please. As well as creating and retaining places for recreation, for the development of community, and for our neighborhoods. Next slide, please. Now, of course, we also prevent the worst case scenarios, as we mentioned in our previous study session. So we prevent decline by having development regulations in place.
Let's note for the record, that is not Lone Tree.
That is correct. That is actually Rio Vista, California, another development that went into decline actually pre-08, but that is a picture from 2014. Next slide, please. All right, what does Chapter 17 provide to us? It provides a transparent planning and review process, mechanisms to protect public and city interests, and a blueprint for developers that outlines the responsibilities of both the city and the developer, because sticky notes and paper maps can only take us so far. Next slide, please. All right, as previously mentioned in our study session, the proposed major amendments are to revise the enforcement and penalties, the removal of Article 9 for exemptions, the addition of the FAA abrogation notice requirements, clarification of application submittal requirements and review processes, and the meat of our discussion this evening, the inclusion of a reference to the city's landscape design guidelines for public rights-of-way, as well as an addition of security provisions for required landscape improvements as proposed. Next slide, please. All right, so jumping into the why. Why are we proposing that we include additional provisions for landscaping in the city for our subdivisions? To ensure that we can have the same quality and character of development that we have in existing Lone Tree. So we have our medians, we have our entryways, we have our tree lawns. Next slide, please. Now, this particular set of slides comes from the Canyons, which is a development in Castle Pines. This development is brand new, so I want to note this is not at all a development that is in decline. This just began build out in 2019. It is very new. The only purpose for including these slides is to show what hypothetically a development that did not reach full build out might look like if we did not have a way of ensuring full build out. But again, I will reiterate that this is just beginning and it is still under construction. Next slide, please.
Rashana, before you move on, since council is aware of kind of where, can you put that slide back up? What I will be asking questions about later is what phase of development will start releasing the surety and what would it look like had that happened? So that's kind of what I'm trying to understand. I recognize this is nowhere near completion and we're not going to talk about any other community or any other community's rules and regs. But what I want to understand is at what point in development will we, if council chooses to move forward with the planning commission and staff recommendation, when will we start seeing the tree lawns and the entryway in the process? Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. All right, next slide, please. So to kick off our discussion, we have some questions that we would like to pose because this is really going to guide the direction of our code based on how we answer these questions. So the first question that we need to ask ourselves is green infrastructure, landscaping. Do we consider green infrastructure in and along the public right-of-way to be a public improvement? If so, should the city require the review and approval of landscape plans for those areas? And if so, should the city require a financial guarantee for those improvements to ensure their completion? So those are a couple of thoughts to have milling through your brain as you start to think about where we're going and what staff is proposing for these particular updates. If we determine that green infrastructure is a public improvement, and if we continue to answer yes to those particular questions, then we'll want to think about what some of those consequences and impacts might be in the event that we have a development that perhaps does go dormant as that worst case scenario picture that I presented earlier. So at the last study session, council asked for some additional information about what our neighboring jurisdictions are doing relative to landscaping requirements, as well as relative to the provision of security for those requirements. So starting on the left-hand side of your screen, we have Castle Pines. They have no landscaping requirement for their subdivisions, as well as, of course, no security because they have no landscaping requirement. Moving along the line, we have Douglas County, which generally has no landscaping requirement for their subdivisions. Occasionally, they noted that they may have required that in the past. Then we move on to Centennial. They do have a landscaping requirement for their subdivisions, and they do have a 115% security provision for those landscaping improvements. They do also provide flexible options on essentially a case-by-case scenario via subdivision improvement agreements. Then we move on up the line to Castle Rock, which has a landscaping requirement. They require 115% security. They do not provide available options in flexibility. Then we move on up the line for Fort Collins. The reason that we included this is because they have a similar approach to trails and open space, and it was just an additional comparison that we could provide to you. So they have a landscaping requirement with 125% security, but they also provide flexible options on a case-by-case basis. And then finally, we have our neighbor Parker that has a landscaping requirement with 120% security and no flexible options available. So that gives you a quick picture of the spectrum of the various requirements that are in our immediate jurisdiction. I might have the next slide, please. Before we go on to proposed code changes, I will also note that the city has provided a landscaping security requirement for one development in the past, and that was for the retreat. And that is the one instance of the city doing so, and that was via sub-area plan requirements.
And Rashawn, if I recall correctly, it was a good idea that we had that in place, because when they had initially requested the release of that, there was about 30% of the work yet to be remained, and that tool was the opportunity for staff to go back and say, this is where you're deficient. And then as soon as they corrected those things, they immediately received the full surety back. So I think that's an important, the requirement acted as it should and ensured that the development was in compliance with the city guidelines or the city regulations. And then, so I thought that was an interesting anecdote. So please continue.
That is correct. It worked exactly as it's intended, and the final release was actually last month, July of 2020. So in answer, if I could go back to the previous slide, sorry, my apologies. Thank you, Jay. In answer to our previous discussion relative to the need to both have transparency for our developers so that our developers can read the code and have a general understanding of what Lone Tree requires, and also to have some flexible options in place so that staff and the city has the option to perfect planning through the process as we move through these different developments. Staff is proposing a couple of code changes. The first and foremost, I have it highlighted in green, is we have integrated in various sections of the code our proposal for alluding and clearly stating in some cases that there is a flexible option that may be available. We're not guaranteeing it, but we're providing it up front. And we also iterate that it is the applicant's responsibility to discuss in the early stages of their pre-submittal and their application submittal to discuss these options with staff. So these are a couple of areas where we have identified it during the preliminary plan process. Next slide, please. Again, we reiterate this in the applicant's responsibility. It is the applicant's responsibility to consult with the city regarding interpretation and application, as well as phasing proposals for development and any options that might be available regarding surety alternatives. Next slide, please. Again, another area where we iterate that the developer shall provide the necessary security to ensure improvements are made, and that the city may also require the developer to provide security to ensure completion of landscaping improvements. Next slide, please. Okay, now where we get into the nitty-gritty. So this first section, these are the proposed code changes that provide basic protections to the city. So this is the standard meat and potatoes of final plat, subdivision improvement agreement, and with that subdivision improvement agreement also goes a security, whether it's via cash or letter of credit. This is how the process works for all of our standard infrastructure, roads, curb, gutter, sidewalk. So you have the final plat, and in this instance with landscaping, they would submit their project estimate. That would then be paired with that subdivision improvement agreement and that security via cash or letter of credit. If those two are approved by the city, then they would have three different options as code is currently written. They may provide 115% security upfront prior to approval of any construction plans. If it is a smaller development or the developer has a large bankroll, they may choose to build out their infrastructure, come back to the city to get probationary acceptance of those improvements, the same as we do for our infrastructure improvements. And then they would be able to provide 15% security. That 15% security would cover the warranty window, essentially, that probationary window between initial acceptance and final acceptance. And that would allow us to cover any defects that may occur in that 2-year window. Or, very small number of cases, a developer may decide to build everything up front, to build up their lots, then come for final inspection following that probationary window of review, and in that case, no security is required. So again, this is how code is currently written for all other infrastructure improvements, and we would propose as the meat and potatoes portion of our code relative to landscaping surety that this would also remain as that basic financial protection for the city. Now, With that said, next slide, please. Just a reiteration of where this is built in currently. You'll note in the very beginning, it does state when required. So it is still not a shall, it leads with a when required. So there is currently still some flexibility built into the code, but we would like to have a little bit more. Now, if I may have the next slide, please. Now, this is where we start talking about our flexible options. So, development restrictions in lieu of security. Now, this goes back to those new additions to code where we identify that the applicant may discuss with staff up front if there are options and alternatives for them to provide different development triggers instead of having to put up that 115% or 15% security. So with that, the process would start out in a very similar fashion. Final plat, landscaping, project estimate, subdivision improvements agreement, although in this case, instead of the cash or letter of credit, they would be providing a phasing plan with very specific development triggers. And some of those development triggers, as an example, for single-family detached developments, staff and the city could propose that all of the landscaping would have to be completed once the developer reaches a threshold of 75% build out per phase. So that would be per final plat. However the developer chose to phase it, they would be allowed to build out 75% of their lots, sell those lots, sell those homes, and then when they reach that 75% threshold, which would be tracked via our building permit process, that is then when the developer would have to complete all of their landscaping improvements in the right-of-way, or they could also choose at that time to provide that landscaping surety if they wanted to. In the case of single-family attached or commercial developments, because we do have some developments that are going to be combinations, in that case, they would be allowed to pull their building permit, build that single-family attached structure or those commercial structures, and then prior to getting their certificate of occupancy, they would have to complete those landscaping improvements, or same instance, they could choose to provide security at that time. And then park site improvement plans and other utility improvements, those of course would not be tied into the landscaping improvement triggers for development. And to give you an idea of what it might look like in code, next slide please. This is one version or option for how that code could be written, where we would again state when required, the applicant shall provide itemized estimate. It will be paired with the subdivision improvements agreement, and then they will propose triggers. And here we identify essentially the maximum threshold that the city might choose to allow. So here we put 75%. That of course is and can be variable depending on council's direction. But that is the way that that particular schematic might actually look while drafted in code. Next slide. All right, so that is a very brief overview in response to the questions posed from study session at the last meeting. These are the proposed next steps as currently falls on the calendar. Of course.
Okay, before we get into next
sure.
steps, let's see if there's any additional questions. Did you have any other information to present to us after?
No, Mayor.
Okay, so let's get to questions before we talk next steps.
Sure.
So I think you provided a lot of great information, and I particularly also appreciated the detail in the packet that was provided. So I want to turn to council to see if anybody has any follow-up questions based on what you heard this evening and read in the packet. Go ahead, Wayne.
So I think that some of the work that we've done on the code, not this particular part, has been cleaning up things that seemed ambiguous, where there was so much flexibility that the intent wasn't always clear to everyone. And I just want to make sure that we have sufficient, that legal counsel believes we have sufficient clarity here to allow the flexibility, but not to be ambiguous.
And we have done numerous iterations with Linda throughout our updates. This particular new update, she is in the process of reviewing it. And Linda, please chime in as needed. Otherwise, we can bring those additional notes back to you. But it has been a very fluid process throughout the various editions.
Thanks. And given the fact that I do think we want to be as clear as possible from the beginning, and council needs to understand what we're adopting the first time around, I would like to ask Linda to just amplify or say maybe we would benefit from actually seeing revised language.
Yeah, I haven't.
And you have to speak up.
Yeah.
Because
I haven't had the opportunity to vet this language with planning staff. So I can't really speak to whether I think that it provides enough flexibility with enough definition.
Okay.
So I think I'd like that opportunity, but I do think that requiring some sort of landscape improvement collateral or security benefits the city. And I think you're sort of, behind the curve on that front. So I think it's a good idea in general, in terms of, what the triggers are in that and that. I think we're still working on language.
Okay, and that, I guess I would say I'm also in favor of, having things written so that they work the way they're supposed to. I just want to make sure that we're flexible and clear.
which important things in any year, but particularly in COVID. Jay, did you have comments?
Yeah, no, I was gonna say, when I initially saw this last meeting, I was a little concerned. I want to be as developer friendly as possible. But then when reviewing the packet, I was rest assured that this isn't just unique to Lone Tree,
Right.
that it's happening all around. And it seems very reasonable to do the 115, so.
And I think just as a follow-up, it's always important for us to note that one of the reasons Lone Tree became a city was the people that lived in the community at the time's reaction to the lack of rules and regs regarding developments and what the developers were required to complete and or finish before they picked up stakes and moved on. And I think we have certainly had nothing but the best experience with developers in the city since the city was formed. But I think having guidelines and rules that everybody sees and understands and are clear, I think is one of the important reasons. So I think we're definitely being true to our founders in the community by taking a look at this. Kath, do you have anything?
Good. I'm with the general comments from last time, having those resolved now.
Okay, and Mike, how about you?
No, I'm glad that we're providing some flexibility with this approach so that developers can perform and save some money on cost in terms of surety along the way. I think giving them that flexibility makes us very competitive, but still protective of what we're trying to protect.
Okay, and I think I heard you say, Roshana, and I just want to confirm that the process is consistent with collecting and then remitting back this surety is consistent with the way we do it across the board in the city.
Correct.
Correct? You did say that. Yes. Okay. I think the other question I have is language. And now, of course, I can't find my own question. Here it is. Okay. As I'm trying to decipher this with my engineer brain, not having a legal degree, so I want to make sure I understand this correctly. It's that should the surety be required once 75% of development threshold is hit in the phase, 100% of the landscaping would have to be put in before we'd be issuing COs for the remaining 25%. Is that?
So yes, as that proposal was put in, that would be the intent.
If that's the option they chose to go under.
Correct. Now, with that said, and this comes back to the iteration that would have to happen between staff and Linda and input from council and direction from council, is that potentially could be even more flexible. We were trying to provide that flexibility and still hit that bar of having a very clear guideline for developers to know exactly what their bare minimum is going to be. If there is discomfort with that hard line, then we might be able to find something that is even more flexible, wherein it just refers to the development phasing and triggers as identified in the subdivision improvements agreement drafted between the city and the developer.
Okay, Roshana, but the question I asked was, as it's currently written, is what I said accurate?
Yes.
As it's currently written, so once 75% of a phase is hit, no other COs would be issued for that phase until all of the landscaping goes in for the entire phase under consideration. That's
Correct.
how it is currently written. Okay, yeah.
Yes.
So I'm sorry,
Sorry,
to clarify.
that's correct.
It's built, no more building permits will be issued.
So that means they couldn't start, if there were 100 homes, 75 were built, they couldn't, no permit for the 76th building would be issued until it was done. So
Or they
it's-
put up security.
Or they put it, right. But so how does that work? So while they finish that 75th home, let's just say we're talking about 100 homes, they're not going to stop. They're going to be moving ahead, right? So when you say no building permits will be issued, explain to me what this means, 75% residential build out. So does that mean occupied homes? Does that mean, and is that kind of some of the language that probably needs to be evaluated? Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so I need to understand what we're doing to Wynn's earlier point. This isn't clear to me. So I probably am, I need better clarity on what residential build out means. If it means COs issued for homes, it means building permits issued, and I think that's an important distinction because it speaks to how much money the developer has back in there. If they've sold the homes, COs are there and people are living in there, they've gotten revenue in from the development and have that money that they're getting paid. So I do think this is an important thing to clarify. And I'm not sure where I land on what we should be doing, guys. But as I was talking about this, I wonder even if we should have some kind of a sliding scale based on the number of homes in a phase. You know what I mean? If there's thousands of homes in a phase or hundreds of homes in a phase,
Yeah.
we might want something different than if it's a smaller 100 or 200 or 50 in the first phase. Do you guys understand? And kind of, well, what can council please react to what I just said?
I agree, and I would also ask, is there anything that would, let's say I've been approved for 3 phases, and I build to 74 homes in phase 1, 74%, and then I move to 74 homes in phase 2, and I do the same in phase 3, and then I say, I'm out of here. And the rest of the homes and the rights of way are not done. I mean, you know, I'm thinking some other place than Lone Tree, but, you know.
Right. Well, to me, it's just not clear what we're asking
Yeah.
for. So that's my biggest concern. It's not clear. And I do think the size of the phases should have something to do with the amount
But it's relative though, right?
Right, that's what I'm saying, like a lower number of homes may be a higher trigger and a lot more homes may be a lower trigger. And since it's not clear to me whether or not it's issuing a CO or it's issuing a building permit, I don't think developers stop when they get to 75% of their building permits. They're continuing to build. That time is money for them. So what are we asking for them from? Is it when we issue the 75th building permit? But
that could be at the beginning, right?
do you understand my,
Yeah, but I just think, I mean, they would have to build that into their planning.
so if I'm the developer reading this, what is this telling me?
That I need to get that landscaping done prior to that 76th home, right?
Well, that's not what, I mean, to me, it was unclear.
Or provide the surety.
Prior to building that building permit. That's an outside time limit.
And so since I'm not as familiar with developers, when you go for building permits, do you go for them in chunks? Do you get an individual building permit for each individual home?
Each filing or
Each- right,
whatever.
That's what I'm saying, like how many are built at one time?
Each, they might come in and pull a couple, but I mean, usually it's one.
They're in.
2 or 3. What we've seen historically with our builders that have been in the city, like for Heritage Hills area, for example.
So we would be able, there would be a point in time where we could, not that we would want to, that if they didn't have their landscaping done, we all know what 75% residential build out means, and there is the appropriate time without causing undue burden on them. They'll be like, wait a minute, what? I can't have my 76? Like they'll know in advance if we're talking 100 homes.
Mhm.
Everyone thinks that staff is saying that is very clear to the builder.
I
This
think we
language
worked
is
with-
clear.
With Fay and Coventry on this language. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we want to be careful not to make the build-out process, the design, the procurement and the build-out difficult on the builders.
That's what I'm trying to not do.
I'm thinking of a commercial building.
Right.
It's not like 100 homes where you can clearly
Right.
see 75 units and 25 not. I'm also thinking in terms of a builder hiring a concrete contractor and pouring foundations. He may pour all 100 foundations.
Right.
So I don't know what the definition of 75 is, but I trust that our staff and our community relations people have a view and that it'll be communicated and agreed to between them and the developer on what 75% means for that project.
And I guess I would prefer to just be, I would prefer as the elected official approving this that I understand it too.
Right.
And right now I don't. So before I make a rule, I want to fully understand the implications of the rule. And I guess part of it, I do think having our legal team have the opportunity to fully vet this is also important. And I don't know if council noticed or not, but we don't even have the full, we have a summary of the planning commission action, but we didn't even get the full minutes from the planning commission on this project either, to read. So I've chatted with staff, but there isn't, Seth, an urgency to move this tonight to first reading, right? Is there an urgency from staff's perspective? So there's a part of me that's like, well, I would, as the elected official approving it, I want to understand fully what I'm approving and I want to make sure that as high regard as I have for staff, the buck stops with us. And whether our staff is very clear on it, the legal team from a developer could question it as well. So I'm not saying they're not 100% right. I'm just saying right now I'm not 100% confident.
So I think, Mayor, we can dial this in, and I think what we'll bring back is we'll show you sort of what we're going to use to track this so that we don't get to the 75th home and there's a surprise, for anybody, and sort of how we'll work with the home builder to, all along the way, make sure that we don't get to that point where suddenly they're stopped in their tracks because of this rule.
Okay, I would also like you guys to evaluate this sliding scale based on the number of homes in a phase. I'm curious, I don't have it's more, I'd like to understand your thoughts about whether that makes sense or doesn't make sense. And if it would be on a smaller developer, if it would be less burdensome than a large scale development to do it that way, if they chose this option. That's another piece of it.
Well, and if I may, Mayor,
Yeah.
one of the additional components of this particular proposal is, keep in mind the schematic that we saw where it says final plat, and then it says landscaping estimate, and then it says subdivision improvements agreement. For anything that is a single family detached development, final plat is the second part of that process. So before that comes the preliminary plan. And the preliminary plan is really where the bulk of all of our development review occurs for our subdivisions. So that is where the developer is showing us master plan, individual phasing, streets, curb, gutter. Our engineering team is looking at all of the preliminary civil. They're looking at individual lots. Our surveyor is looking at all of the boundary lines. So when that preliminary plan is approved, the developer knows exactly what the city has approved for the master plan. And then they come back to us with each of those individual phases. And those have to be very much in line with very few inaccuracies or changes relative to the approved preliminary plan. And that's when they have, whether it's the 100 lots or the 1,000 lots, they are numbered. Those go into our system, those go into the assessor site, so it's tracked in GIS, and then, they will know exactly how many lots have been approved in that final plat.
So should we be referencing the final plat then in this and say at the time of the final plat, the 75% number will be identified then? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, and that's where the portion for the guarantee of improvements, that's
Yep.
the section of code that it aligns with, is
Right.
final plat and subdivision improvement agreement. And we can reiterate that in code as well. But that is the section that it is within.
Okay, so if I understood correctly, this 75% would be very clear at the time of the final plat. There would be a very clear understanding of what that is at the time of the final plat?
Correct, because if their final plat is approved, they know exactly how many lots they've been approved for.
Prior to, right, and that how many, does the language in the final plat, on the plat, it doesn't speak to this, but in the agreement associated with the plat, would it speak to the 75%?
Correct. Yes, if it's going to be automatic 75%, that would be embedded in the language. If council provides direction that you would like to have a more flexible code so that there's more flexibility for city leadership and developer to negotiate those subdivision improvement agreements, then that can be more flexible. I think certainly we would also like to hear from council if you would like that trigger to be based on the issuance of building permits or on certificates of occupancy, because I heard that question, and we will go whichever direction.
And as I read the work that some of our neighboring jurisdictions do, it's COs.
Mm-hmm.
The language in here was COs, which is why I assume COs, not building permits, which again, I think it's there's some ambiguity there. Kelly.
Thank you. I would just advocate on that point for building permit. One of the things we don't want to do is have homeowners or future homeowners get in the middle
Yes.
of the situation, which has happened before, and we certainly don't want to hold a homeowner hostage. So if we do it at building permit stage, again, the builder knows well ahead of time what the expectations are, and the city has leverage, I think, at the right time.
Right, without impacting. But while you're up there, Kelly, help me understand where that's clear, that it's a building permit and not a CO in this document. Because if I'm the developer and I'm used to dealing with Douglas County and everybody else in Douglas County is doing COs, I do my read of this, and where does it say it's a building permit?
That is something we can certainly clarify in the language.
I think it's an important thing to clarify in the language.
Absolutely, sure. Point well taken.
Okay. I'm inclined to not have this on for first reading tonight. I'd like time for legal to have a thorough review, and I'd like to make sure that we're being as clear and flexible as we can. I am comfortable with the 75% as written, as long as we understand what it means, although I'd like to explore the phasing just to react to it. I don't know that I feel the need to introduce any more flexibility than what is being offered. And I think one of the questions Rashana has posed to us is, do we want to see more flexibility than this? I think if the questions I ask can be answered, I'm comfortable moving forward. Is there any, but I would also like our city attorney to have the opportunity to weigh in on that flexibility issue, which is another reason I'd like to, is everyone okay? Or does anyone want to see it tonight?
No, I'm good.
Are you?
I'm okay, Christian.
Okay, all right. So do you have any other questions for us that would help provide guidance on what we're looking, what expectations are of council?
I don't. I respect your wishes to continue it and have more input. I would just ask that since it is a public hearing item, if you could leave it on the agenda for the purpose of opening the public hearing and continuing it. That way the city doesn't have to republish.
Republished, absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. And then is there any other, to that point, anything else we need to be aware of if we just continue it?
No, I would just continue it to a date and time certain.
So just to our next council meeting? Okay, okay,
Thank you for the
okay.
feedback.
Thank you, thank you. All right. Okay, moving on, is our 2020 ballot issues, and Jeff Hallwell is going to be presenting to us on that.
Well, thank you, Mayor and Council, for your time tonight. It's hard to believe that election is upon us in November, just a couple months away, that we need to get thinking about and prepared for as we think about the city as well as what's going to happen statewide. So I put together a deck of upcoming ballot measures, primarily statewide ballot measures, but a few things to talk about at the local level as well. Next slide, please. The first one you probably heard about last year, but we will actually finally be seeing it this year, and it's the national popular vote. This is called a veto referendum. The bill referenced here, Senate Bill 1942, was passed by the legislature last year to allow or to submit Colorado to the national compact for electoral votes that would allow our electoral votes to follow the national popular vote. It's important to reference the compact because that's when it would go into effect, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But with this this particular issue, if yes is the outcome on this election, it would put Colorado into that compact. It would be approving Senate Bill 1942 by the people of Colorado. If no is the vote in Colorado, we would choose not to join the national compact with our presidential vote and putting Colorado in the position of using its electoral votes following the national popular vote. So what's happening here in November is the veto referendum. The people of Colorado will get to choose whether they approve or wish to veto Senate Bill 1942. Ultimately, even if the state of Colorado chose to join the compact, enough states, up to 270 electoral votes, have to become part of this compact before it became national or something that the state is acting upon. So for the 2020 election, it is not relevant. However, of course, this piece is relevant for people to choose in Colorado. Did I explain that well enough for you? So that's the number one thing you'll be seeing, and it's been on the ballot for some time now. The second thing that's joining the ballot is the cigarette, tobacco, and nicotine products tax. This was a result of the special or the finale of the General Assembly this year, House Bill 2014-27. They referred a measure to the ballot to create a new tax on the cigarette, tobacco, and nicotine products. The different products have a different tax associated with it, but ultimately they think that this could result in $294 million annually in new revenue for the state of Colorado. There's a very small piece of this that would be for local funding, and that's maintaining existing tobacco funding that cities and counties might receive, but primarily new revenue would go to a state enterprise supporting preschool programs, COVID-19 impacts for public school programs, and any additional things that they can provide to public education. It's primarily an education issue, but anything we currently receive in tobacco taxes would be maintained through this new fund. Next slide, please. The big one of the year is on bingo raffles. There is a referred measure that would reduce the waiting period for a charity to be allowed to receive a gaming license for bingo from 5 years to 3 years. It would also allow those charities, if they want to run this operation, to pay minimum wage to somebody to help run the operation versus only rely on volunteers. So I don't believe that there will be a direct loan tree impact, but it's possible. But charities often use bingos or other types of gaming activities for fundraising. This is in relation to that, and would change the rules around bingo raffles. Next slide.
Jeff?
Yes.
And that doesn't change the requirement for the training that the charities have to have and all of that other support system. It just shortens the waiting period.
Yeah, I believe not, Councilmember
Okay.
Shaw. It's primarily the waiting period, as well as if you can pay a volunteer or a staff to run the operation.
Okay, thank you.
This one, repeal property tax assessment rates, Senate concurrent resolution 20001 is the repeal of the Gallagher amendment. The formula here listed below does two things. One, the law itself requires the General Assembly to set the residential property tax rate or the assessment rate, currently at 7.15%. It prohibits it changes the way that the General Assembly deals with that. They will no longer have to set that rate to be in balance with the 29% that businesses are required to use as their rate in Colorado to be compliant with Gallagher. So it does two things. For one, it'll freeze the 7.15% today, and for a period of time, so that the revenue loss, especially experienced by rural or smaller districts, don't continue to occur because they're required to keep lowering that rate. But two, the 29% rate that's long been paid by businesses or experienced by businesses in Colorado will no longer be frozen at that rate either. And Gallagher, in its the way it's operated for many years, will be very different going forward. So this is that opportunity. I've not seen any polling yet. I imagine we'll start seeing it come this fall, and we'll keep you updated as this moves forward. Next slide, please. Now we go to the initiatives, the ones that people gather signatures for, and there are 4 that have made it to the ballot. One, Initiative 76, is a citizen qualification of electors. It amends the state constitution to only allow U.S. citizens to vote in federal, state, and local elections. So that will be officially on the ballot. A different name, but Initiative 76 is the current number. Next slide, please. Initiative 107 is the restoration of gray wolves in Colorado. It would require the Parks and Wildlife Commission to create and implement a plan to restore gray wolves west of the Continental Divide. And it also provides for compensation for livestock losses if they happen to occur. Initiative 120 would prohibit abortion procedures after 22 weeks of gestation. And the current law, for your reference, enables abortion at any point during pregnancy. So this has made it to the ballot, and you'll be seeing it in November. Next slide, please. Voter approval of gaming limits. Initiative 257 allows local voters to revise gaming limits and to broaden approved games in single bets in Central City, Black Hawk, and Cripple Creek. So locally, they could decide if they want to change their gaming limits or the approved games that could happen in those communities. Next slide, please.
So sorry, can you go back to that one?
Yes.
Just a question. When they say they can broaden the games, what is their process for doing that?
It's a local election, and if this is approved here, it would then follow to their own local election to change those gaming limits. So this doesn't in fact change it immediately. Those communities would have to go back and have that election.
Through a vote of the citizens.
Through a vote of the citizens.
In their city.
Yeah.
And will there be concurrent measures on the ballots in anticipation of it passing, or will they have to wait the full year?
The communities will, I suppose communities that are home rule could do it at their own home rule election if it were coming up. And at a follow-up meeting, I'll find out when those occur for you.
That'd be interesting. Thank you.
I wouldn't be surprised if Black Hawk called a special election.
I'm sure they're super ready for that if they get a chance. Yeah.
January 2.
Yeah.
They would. I would presume they'll be coming soon.
Okay.
But they'll certainly have the opportunity to go with their own cycle as well. Initiative 283 is on the paid family and medical leave insurance program. This is currently, when it says signature line review, they're still currently reviewing signatures for this initiative. But it would create what we've talked about a lot in legislation, a statewide insurance program to provide for paid family and medical leave, and for relative to individuals caring for a new child, for family members, and with serious health conditions. So we should know, they're still looking at it. We should know in the coming days whether this makes the ballot.
And Jeff, this
Yep.
didn't, is that, how do they define family? That was one of the problems with the bill before, I think, that your best friend could be family for the purpose of this law.
I don't have the answer, Councilmember Shaw, but I will follow up with that.
Thank you.
Especially if it makes it to the ballot.
Right.
Thank you. We will find out soon whether it's there. The due date was August 5th, so we're getting close.
Okay.
And one, in fact, just made it onto the ballot yesterday that's been sitting in this queue. So as soon as I have that, I will let you know. Thank you. Voter approval for fee-based enterprises. Initiative 295 would require a election if a new state enterprise is proposed that would use fees to pay for its services versus taxes. If the revenue generated would be over 100 million in its first 5 years of operation. This is a response generally to what you heard about the hospital provider fee or a large state fee that have been created for programs that people believe should be considered in the general fund versus through fees that are separate of TABOR. So what they're trying to do is wrap TABOR around, big fee increases for new state programs. What this wouldn't do is require a new election for raising the fee on a fishing license or something different that just as a general fee or fees that we charge locally either. It'd be, I suppose if we created an enterprise that had a $100 million revenue over 5 years, we might have to grapple with this, but this is what they're trying to get after, not every single fee that occurs by state and local government.
So Jeff, if the cigarette, I understand it's not going to affect something that's on the ballot, but if the cigarette tax, which generates 294 million, was on the ballot, let's say this passed. So, and then the cigarette tax, you said that was an enterprise?
That would actually be a tax, the cigarette.
Okay, I thought you said to create an enterprise
It funds an enterprise that's already created, I think.
The enterprise already exists. So that's what I was trying to understand. So it's not a new state enterprise, so it wouldn't be subject to this.
It wouldn't be subject to this.
Okay.
And if it were voted on as a tax and it just went to fund an existing enterprise, say it was the.
So funding existing enterprises is okay. Funding a new enterprise would be subject to a statewide, if this passed.
Correct.
Got it. Thank you for clarifying that for me.
And if they chose to use fees instead of taxes as well.
Right.
I suppose
Got
if
it.
they just
Got
chose
it.
to use taxes,
Yep.
they'd have to do TABOR anyway. And then the final initiative that made the ballot yesterday was the reduction of the state income tax rate. This would reduce statewide income tax rate for businesses and individuals. Currently, it's a flat rate of 4.63%. Based upon adjusted income, it would reduce that to 4.55% statewide. So this was led by Senator Sonnenberg. It's an Independence Institute initiative that began last year. The Secretary of State announced yesterday that it is on the ballot.
Jeff, have they done any estimates to say what the state revenue loss to the state would be?
They've not done that.
Got it.
I will, now that it's on the ballot, I'll see if they have that, Mayor, but yeah, they're, this is at least new now that we have to be dealing with that, but they're doing it as we speak. Then a few of the.
I'm sorry,
Go.
Can you clarify, just don't some of these have a higher threshold of number of votes that are required? Yes,
the electoral, the one that is a constitutional issue about requiring people to be a U.S. citizen to vote in an election is a constitutional amendment. So it was the citizenship requirement for election. The rest are statutory measures. So
so this one's statutory.
This one is statutory. So it would be.
That's interesting.
Prescribed in statute, not constitution. So it's also not permanent. The legislature could come back and ask for an increase again. So it wouldn't keep 4.55% forever in constitution.
In perpetuity, yeah.
Right.
Good, great question, son. And now some, local initiatives, and I believe more will be coming. Their deadline has not yet hit, so we're still going to be hearing about what some local governments are doing around tax policy, but a few just to get you thinking, and we'll bring more back this fall when they're announced. The city of Denver has proposed and on the ballot a 0.25% sales tax increase to address homelessness. So that's been something they've been thinking about a long time, but it's now on the ballot, and we'll see how that fares in 2020. City of Castle Pines, this is interesting. These are not yet on the ballot, but they have been studying 3 ballot issues that would be for new things that they're looking at the community. They've surveyed the community, and now they have the opportunity to consider it prior to early September when it has to be referred to the ballot. And the first is an 8.28 mil property tax to support the construction of a new recreation center. The second is an 8 mil property tax to support road maintenance, repair, and reconstruction. And then the third is an excise tax on commercial and residential development, pretty similar to what Parker proposed and passed last year. And all 3 on the ballot, of course, would be a lot of new different revenue sources for the city of Castle Pines. We don't know yet what they'll choose to do, all 3, 2, or 1,
or none.
Or none. So that's under review, and I presume we'll know by the end of the month what they choose to do. And then finally, the only school district election I'm aware of is that Cherry Creek Public Schools has decided to go do a bond election for $150 in bonds for new and deferred maintenance on facilities, and then a $35 million mill levy, or a mill levy to reach $35 million for its operations. So just north of us, they'll be voting on that as well. But like I said, a lot more of this will be coming in the coming weeks. So I'll have another update, in September when we know exactly what's hitting the local ballots as well.
It's going to be a busy time for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to answer questions as well. Thank you for having me tonight.
Does anybody else have any other follow-up on the very crowded, becoming more crowded by the day ballot?
That's correct.
Start studying now.
Lots of good controversy about to happen.
Right.
Yeah, Jeff, with the cigarette tax for that $294, so communities will remain whole, but the rest of that money will be going, is it strictly to the schools? Is that your understanding?
It's a combination. The way the legislation was written is to offset COVID-19 impacts to public education.
Okay.
And then it goes into a lot of different formulas around the state education fund. And then a third tier into a state preschool fund that would support preschool programs for the state. But it was pretty clear about saying that all new revenue would be for state programs, except for
supporting schools.
Supporting schools, yes.
Because the COVID impacts, I am hopeful aren't going to be for forever, but this tax will be. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, we'll have some tie to school, whether it's education or K-12 or preschool. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you very much. Okay, so that was a short study session in comparison to what we have been doing lately, you guys, which means we have a long council meeting.
Yeah.
But Seth, do you have anything else for us for the good of the cause? Okay, and anybody else have anything they want to share? All right, well then I think we are ready for our dinner break. So we will close our study session. Thanks, everybody.